It's a very beautiful sonnet because Yeats had other things in mind. He's actually talking about Christ and the Virgin Mary when a mortal gets together with an immortal and gives birth to somebody that will change the course of time. And so he starts with Leda and the Swan. Just like Helen changed the course of time, 2,000 years later Christ came, changed the course of time, and 2,000 after Christ something will happen to change the course of time. Yeats thought in 2,000-year cycles. So I started, this is now ancient Greece, Homeric Greece. And it shows you the main characters in the Iliad. At this time, we're talking about 8th century BCE. And at this time, Greece was a federation. It's made up of many kingdoms. All of those names are kings. Achilles up there in the land of Thea is a king. Locris, or one of the Ajax lives. Athens has its king. Salamis, Sparta, Argos, Pylos, Ithaca, Messene. All of those were kingdoms. The strongest king of this whole area was in Messene, which is, Messene is right there. You can see this down here, it says Agamemnon, right there. And his brother, Menelaus, who was married to Helen, is right here in Sparta. So this is where everything takes place. Now the myth grows out of the need for these people here, this kingdom, to get over here, the Hittite civilization, where all the wealth is. All the trade is in here. The Greeks needed access to the Black Sea. This is the Black Sea, in order to trade here. However, in order to do that, you had to sail to Troy and pay a lot of taxes in order to gain a thoroughfare here, the Bosphorus, to get to the Black Sea. And Troy controlled that area. And it's also a very windy place, Troy. So some ships had to remain for months at a time at this point before they could go into here and trade. This bothered the Greeks here. They needed an excuse to find a way of getting to the Black Sea. That's where the myth of Helen comes in. Because the myth says that Helen was abducted by Paris, a prince of Troy, and in order to get her back, they had to wage war on Troy to retrieve the woman. Economically, what they wanted to do is find an excuse in order to get to the Black Sea. And so the myth grew around that need. The myth of Helen and the Trojan myth has all kinds of beginning. It can start with Leda and the Swan when Helen was born. Other times it starts with the judgment of Paris, which is how does Paris fit into this abduction of Helen? It can also be Zeus's will, as you find at the beginning of the Iliad, that Zeus thought the world was overpopulated, and in order to get rid of some of the people, waged war in Troy, just like the flood in the Bible. So there are many beginnings. The Iliad emphasizes the judgment of Paris and the abduction. Those two myths are used throughout the Iliad by Homer to tell us how this story began. So when Helen was abducted and taken to Troy, her husband, Menelaus, the brother of the commander of the Greeks, Agamemnon, decided that he would help his brother get the wife back. Now, how did they get all of these men involved to join up? Well, first of all, they want to raid the place. That's the main idea. You go, you join because of the booty that you're going to receive. That's again the economic reason. The mythic reason is that when Helen was ready to marry, everybody wanted to marry her, all these men. And her father didn't know how to handle this, because if he chose one of the men, what would happen with the others? They might attack him. And Odysseus, another hero who has his own epic, came up with the idea and said to her father, what if you make everybody promise that they will abide by whomever Helen selects, and they would stand by her if anything ever happens to her. If they don't want to do that, they don't have to be in the pool of possible bridegrooms. So they said, okay, all of these people. Now, once Helen is abducted, they're obligated to keep their oaths. And at this time, in 8th century BC, oaths and pride and shame are very important. We're talking about a shame culture in the 8th century. No one wants to be shamed, and everybody wants his pride intact. So they all decide they're going to help because they're going to get something out of it also. So that's how we start out. That's the myth. And there are all kinds of digressions to this myth. There are all kinds of parts to it. Let me see here. Oh, here are the myths. By the way, the Trojan horse, which is a symbol of the Iliad, was by Epius, a man called Epius. This horse is by Fred Kuffler. That's why I have it down there. Okay, so the Trojan War, now we're talking about something that's supposed to have occurred around 1184 BCE. That's in the 12th century BCE. That's during the Bronze Age of Greece. This was an oral society. There was no written language during the Bronze Age. There was a syllabary. It was called, what was it called? Linear A, V. That's what it was called. There was a linear A in the period before the Bronze Age, which was the Minoan period, but we don't have to go there. But a syllabary is not an alphabet. It's a symbolic kind of language that uses symbols and used mostly in palaces to count the number of jugs of oil or wine or wheat, etc. There's no literature involved with that. That was in the Mycenaean age. When Troy fell during this period, language disappeared, and it was followed by many hundreds of years, which scholars refer to as the Dark Age. And they refer to it as the Dark Age, not because it was dark, but because we don't know anything about it. It's dark to us. That's not true as much today, where more information is coming out. But it was a period without a language. It was a period made up mostly of peasants. It was a period where the palaces had been destroyed. It was an illiterate period made up mostly of farmers. And we come out of this age around 800 BCE, which is called the Archaic period, which is the period of Homer. So the idea here is, here Homer is writing a story that occurs in 1184 BCE, but he's writing it in 725 BCE. That's almost 500 years after it occurred. It's almost the same as the present population being divorced from Shakespeare. We're about the same distance from Shakespeare as Homer was in his time from the Trojan War myth, which was a myth, although some people felt that it was based in fact. It became a legend. A legend is when something is based on a possible truth. Not until 1897 or so, when a German, Heinrich Schliemann, who loved Homer and the Iliad, read it and decided that he was going to uncover the true Troy, and went to Turkey, to this area where Troy was supposed to be, Hisarlik it's called today, and started digging. But he wasn't really an archaeologist, and he destroyed a great deal more than he discovered. But he was the first to discover a level. Since then, and the work is still going on today, 9 levels have been uncovered. So there were at least 9 Troys that were destroyed at various points. But level 5, level 6 and 7, scholars believe today could be the Troy that Homer is talking about, because they discovered at that level a lot of weapons, a lot of destruction, so there might have been some kind of war going on. So now, it's still a myth. The Trojan War myth is a myth, with the possibility of being based on some incident that occurred around 1184. And what Homer does in bringing this myth into the Iliad can be seen almost as an encyclopedia of mythology, because almost, I'd say, 80% of all the Greek myths that we have can be found in the Iliad. And most of the literary production, most of the literary work that occurs after the Iliad is based on the Iliad and the Odyssey. For example, the tragedies of the 5th century BCE. There were over 1,000 tragedies written during that 100-year period. Only 33 are extant today. But from the fragments of the lost ones, and from the 33 that we have in full, we can see that most of the myths that are used in those tragedies come directly from Homer's Iliad. And I list those main myths, the groups of myths that can be found. I have 5 categories there. I mean, somebody else could make more. But I think these 5 categories probably cover all the myths that we have today. The most important is number 1, and they go by house, the house of Atreus. Atreus is the patriarch of that particular house that produces the myths in that group. And this is the myth that includes Agamemnon, Menelaus, and the main leaders that you find in the Iliad that go to Troy. So all the myths that are associated with Agamemnon and his extended family are in the house of Atreus. So that's the Trojan War myth, basically. But then there's another. There's the house of Thebes. Thebes includes the stories of Oedipus. Most of you have heard of Oedipus, the king, who married his mother, killed his father. But Thebes occurred before Troy. Those myths predate Homer. And there were many epics that had to do with the house of Thebes, maybe more than a half a dozen, all lost. All we know about some of those epics are fragments that exist. However, what Homer does, and this is the point, he takes some of those characters and he uses them in the Iliad, although they would be much older than any of the warriors fighting in the Iliad. For example, one of the most important characters in the Iliad is a man by the name of Diomedes, who has a big part in the Iliad, especially Book 5, which is devoted to Diomedes. Diomedes was one of the warriors in the Theban War, which occurred before the Trojan War. And yet in the Iliad, he's a very young warrior, much younger than the warriors from the house of Atreus. So you see how Homer uses these characters as he pleases without paying attention to where they come from. That's poetic license in poetry. Another important group of myths is Heracles, known to you probably as Hercules. The Greek word for Hercules is Heracles. And Heracles is the oldest hero in Greek mythology. He was around long before the Trojan War. As a matter of fact, he was the first hero to attack Troy before the Trojan War as we know it. So he took over Troy long before the Greeks that came after him. Nevertheless, he becomes a character in the Iliad, and he's used some 12 times throughout the Iliad as a paradigm, as a parable, as someone to compare the present to that past. And then we also have Jason and the Golden Fleece, also predates the Trojan War. The Jason expedition occurred before the Trojan War, and yet in Homer, it's used as if Jason is around in the present time. Now, the only reason we know about Jason myths is because somebody much later than Homer, he's called Apollonius of Rhodes, wrote a novel called Jason and the Golden Fleece, which was based on the original myth which occurred before Homer. So you have all of these myths that Homer is using in various ways. And another thing that Homer does that makes it hard to read the Iliad is that he never uses the entire myth of any particular story. He only uses the part that refers to whatever he wants to do with it, how he wants to use it. So he assumes that his audience is familiar with these myths, and he doesn't have to go through the whole thing. So it becomes difficult when you're reading the Iliad to say, well, how is he using this? Who are these people? What did they do? And sometimes, like the Heracles myth, he'll use it, like I said, 12 times throughout the Iliad and give you a different piece from the entire myth. So if you were to take all these pieces out and put them together, you might get a full story of Heracles, but not complete. So that goes on throughout. And then I say there's other myths. For example, Phaedra, Medea. You can trace those myths to these families too, but usually they're referred to as other, because we know them through the tragedies that were written on them. Now, for the Trojan War myth, the house of Atreus up there, we do have fragments and even some whole books or chapters of the epics that have to do with this particular war. And that's called the epic cycle that I showed there. The epic cycle is a collection of 8 epics, like Homer's, that tell the entire story of the Trojan War myth from its very beginning to its very end. For example, that first book, Kypria, tells you how the Trojan War began. How was it that Paris found Helen, etc., etc. The next book that comes into the story is then Homer's Iliad. Then you have another one called Aethiopis, Little Iliad, Ilio-Perses, Nostoi. When you get to Nostoi, that means returns in Greek. Nostoi means to return. What happens to the veterans that are coming back from the Trojan War? And one of the main veterans is the next book, Odyssey, Odysseus. And the last one, Telegony, is the death of Odysseus. What happens to Odysseus when he comes back home? He takes care of all the suitors that are after his wife. He sets his kingdom in order. then what? And there's a whole story again. Now, we have these fragments and these books because in the 2nd century BC, there was a scholar by the name of Proclus who did a summary of all of these books, and that summary survived to this day. So we have a summary of what happens in all of these books, except for the books themselves, other than the Iliad and the Odyssey. And I already mentioned the judgment of Paris is something that the Iliad is based on. That is, why did Paris abduct Helen? Well, the judgment of Paris says that, and this is another myth again, I mean, the whole thing is just myths after myth. The judgment of Paris is that there was a party given on Olympus where the gods lived. And the only goddess that was not invited was Eris, E-R-I-S. Well, Eris means strife. And you don't want strife in a party. So she wasn't invited. She gets mad at not being invited. And she takes a golden apple and throws it into the crowd, which it says, to the fairest. And of course, the 3 goddesses that think they're the fairest, Aphrodite, Athena, and Hera, the wife of Zeus, grab at the apple. But they each want it. So they go to Zeus and say, you select which one of us the fairest. So he's not going to get in between these 3 women. So he says, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to let a mortal judge you. There's this nice shepherd boy called Paris, and he'll decide. So they go to Paris, who at the time is a shepherd. There's a long story why he's a shepherd, which would take another full hour to go through. But they find him, and each of the goddesses bribe him. Hera says, I'll give you a kingdom if you select me. Athena says, I'll give you wisdom. She's the goddess of wisdom. Aphrodite says, I'll give you the most beautiful woman in the world. Well, Paris says, that's it. That's what I want. And so she promises Helen, and now you see the division of the gods in the Trojan War. Hera and Athena are opposed to the Trojans because of this incident. Aphrodite is with the Trojans because of this incident. And so the story goes because of this. That's the myth that we have. Okay, enough there. You can ask questions if you like. That's just an idea of the myth that the Iliad is based on. What we have to remember now when we get to the text is that we're in an oral culture, oral society, and you cannot read the Iliad as you read a contemporary novel. First of all, it's not a novel, it's a poem. It's a poem with a particular meter. The meter is called dactylic hexameter, which means, hexameter means 6 meters. And each of those 6 meters is made up of a dactyl. A dactyl is a 3-syllable meter. The closest in English that we can come is Michigan. When I say Michigan, that's a dactyl. However, the Greeks don't put the emphasis on the accent. They put the emphasis on whether the vowel is long or short. So there's a difference there. So the Iliad is made up of something close to, well, precisely 15,697 lines, all made up of dactylic hexameter, where you can substitute a spondee every so often. Spondee is 2 long syllables, a foot made up of 2 long syllables. And it becomes rather complicated. For example, the first 3 meters are always, not always, can be dactyls or spondees. the fifth syllable must always be dactyl. And the sixth syllable, the sixth foot, must always be a spondee. And then there are little changes throughout there. But the important thing is that it's oral. It's an oral society, and it's a very sophisticated writing, because Homer comes at the very end of thousands of years of oral culture. So he knows all the tricks that went before and how it's used. And this is true of most art forms. For example, films today are very sophisticated because of what went before them. They had the advantage of expressionism, of Soviet realism, of Italian neorealism, etc. And it's the same with oral literature. It becomes very sophisticated, but it has its own techniques. For example, one important thing is that repetition becomes very important. In modern writing, if you repeat too much, you get a bad grade. The teacher always says, find a new way of saying this. But not in Homer. Once you say it the right way, you repeat it that way. So when, at some point, as you'll see later, when Agamemnon gives all kinds of gifts for Achilles to come back into the battle, and he sends Odysseus as an emissary to Achilles to report these gifts, Odysseus verbatim gives the list exactly the way Agamemnon did, but he doesn't give the last two lines, which for oral literature is unusual. You're supposed to repeat everything verbatim. Why does he miss the last two lines? Well, that's where the psychology comes in. That's where meaning comes in. Because Odysseus realized that the last two lines, as you'll see later on, would turn Achilles off the way they're put. So he's clever enough not to mention those two lines. But Achilles is also intelligent enough to realize that Odysseus is being cunning, wily, and they become enemies. And you get a great deal from looking at those lines and reading them closely and seeing what's going on. One of the greatness of the Iliad in those books is that it's full of psychology, even though that term was not around at the time Homer was writing. But he has a very acute view of human nature. And one of the reasons that the epic is written the way it is, although it's oral, is because of what it's trying to say to us. For example, what is worth dying for is one of the main themes that you get in the Iliad. Or how should one face death? What is the meaning of honor and fame? Those are main issues. What does recognition of one's mortality teach us? What is God's role in human affairs? All those become very important issues throughout the Iliad. And here I just give some facts to put it in perspective. I did mention that the Trojan War is usually considered to have occurred around 1184. But the Iliad is composed in 725. That's very important because Homer doesn't have any records to base what he's writing on. He's writing it all on hearsay. And he's writing in 725. So most of the things he says in 725 refer to his own society rather than to 1184, a society he has no idea of what it's like. That's why scholars sometimes argue about, for example, there are some points where you get something like, he used his iron spear. Iron wasn't invented in 1184, it wasn't around, so how can Homer say iron spear? Well, it was at 725. In 1184, we call it the Age of Bronze because that's what they used, bronze, not iron. So there's a confusion there. Homer is saying more about the 8th century than he is about the 12th century, because he's writing in the 8th. Another important thing is, depending when you place the Iliad, I put it at 725 because recent scholarship says that it's 725. When I started teaching, the date that we were told in school was 850, was the date of the Odyssey. When you read Herodotus, it's even farther in. It's much closer to 1184. So now today we brought it up to 725. Well, what difference does that make? Well, if the alphabet comes in at 770, that goes to the question of, did somebody write these epics down when we inherited them? Or when were they put on paper the way we know them today? Certainly not in Homer's time. If he composed it in 725, he didn't have an alphabet to compose the Iliad. So it took many hundreds of years before these oral epics were finally put into print, and I try to show you here. It's not till the texts are regularized in the 5th to the 2nd century BC. That is, around that time, they begin to refer to certain oral texts as the Homeric text. The books are not divided in the way we have them today. They're divided into 24 parts because there are 24 letters in the Greek alphabet, and each letter represents a book. That's why they're in 24. Homer didn't divide anything into 24 parts. They were merely songs that were sung by Homer. And again, by saying Homer, as I'll tell you when I get to the poet, who do we mean? Is there a Homer? Or were there many Homers? Who wrote the Iliad? The same person that wrote the Odyssey, or different people? Samuel Butler, an author from the 19th century, claims that a woman wrote the Odyssey and a man wrote the Iliad, because no one could know as much about women in the Odyssey if he was a man. But no one believes it anymore. The Vulgate means the text that is considered the one that's original. Didn't come into play till 150 BCE. So you can see from 725 to 150 before we had a text we could rely on. And then the oldest surviving text that we have today is from 1000 ACE. I used ABC and ACE because it's the proper way today of saying after the common era and before the common era. We're no longer supposed to say before Christ and after Christ. You have to give equal time to everybody. So that's why it's BCE and ACE. And the first printed edition doesn't come in till 1488, and it's found in Venice. So most of the texts we have today have to be based on that first printed edition. Now, what happens between that date and the time that Homer composed is another story. So those are some of the facts about oral literature, but you have to keep in mind that oral literature has certain techniques to it. I mentioned one, the repetition, which becomes very important, but there are many others. And in the hands of a master, he can do with it everything that a present author, a great author, can do. This is what the Greek looked like before I go to something else. The original Greek. And it's read from right to left, left to right. There's a word for it, which in Greek means as the ox moves. Boudokephalos, it goes like this, as the ox plows. This is the way it looks today. this is how classical Greek is written now. And it's not much different from modern Greek, except for all those accents that you have, which the government today is trying to get rid of, and they've gotten rid of them up to the 7th grade. But after the 7th grade, you still have to learn them. There are 5 of them. And they change the way the word is pronounced. Anyway, those are the first 5 lines or so, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines of the Iliad, which is called the proem, P-R-O-E-M, which means the invocation. And it's in those 7 lines that the whole summary of the Iliad is given. In an oral epic, the first word of the epic is the theme of the entire epic. That first word is menim, which means wrath, anger. In the Odyssey, the first word is andra, man. In Virgil's epic of the Aeneid is arms and the man, because he's doing both the Iliad and the Odyssey in one book. And everybody that has written an epic since follows that. And you follow that because Homer did it. And an epic means what Homer did, because there was nothing before it. So that's how we get that particular name. Okay, now here is again a map of ancient Greece, but I use this to show you something about the language of the Iliad. The Iliad is written in a dialect called Ionic. The Ionic dialect, which is presented here in purple. Ionia, which is where these people sang, is in here. That's why when we come to trying to identify the birthplace of a Homer, there was one, it's right in here. That most people think. And these were all very important sites, you know, of Ephesus, Miletus, those lands. But look how close it is to this yellow, which Aeolic language. So the Iliad is in Ionic predominantly, but has a lot of Aeolic in it. It also has a lot of Doric. All these purple shades are Doric. And because Athens was so important, as time goes on, it has a lot of Attic. So it's a made-up language almost. No one ever spoke Homeric Greek, because over the thousands of years that it was created, it used Ionic, Aeolic, Doric, Attic forms of the language. And in order to make the meter fit, sometimes the author had to change endings to fit the meter, and those words don't exist in that form. They're made up by the author. If I go back a minute to here, for example, the first line, what it says, this is wrath, sing, goddess, Peleus' son, Achilles. Sing, goddess, the anger of Peleus' son, Achilles. And translators will translate it in various ways to fit their own meter. But an oral poet knows that he has to have every line in dactylic hexameter. So one of the tricks is that you say what needs to be said at the beginning, and you save the end of the line for something that you can substitute a number of things. For example, let's pretend that it takes almost 3 to 4 feet to say this. Now, if it takes 3 to 4 feet, and I have 6, I have 2 to go. If I've used 4, I have 2 to go. And I know that I have to end with Achilles, because I'm talking about Achilles. So this is what makes all the difference. Do I say Peleus' son Achilles? Do I say godlike Achilles? Do I say brilliant Achilles? Do I say swift-footed Achilles? All of those are adjectives or epithets, as they're known, not epitaphs, which are for dead people, but epithets, which is an adjective. So you save the end so you can manipulate this. And that's where you find a great number of epithets for these characters, which is another technique of oral literature. When am I going to say swift-footed Achilles, or brilliant Achilles, or Piliadeo Achilles, which means Peleus' son, and why am I going to do that? Now, if you're not a good oral singer, you can throw these in to fit your meter. But if you're a Homer, you're going to use the epithet here that says something about the situation that you're in at this very moment. And I'll give you an example of that. One of the epithets of Achilles is swift-footed. Whether he's sitting, running, sleeping, he's always swift-footed Achilles. But towards the end of the Iliad, when he's trying to get at his enemy Hector, and Apollo, the god, is tricking him by having him chase another warrior by the name of Agenor, Apollo takes the form of Agenor. And then Homer says, swift-footed Achilles is chasing Agenor. But now, swift-footed becomes ironic, because no matter how swift-footed he is, he can never catch Apollo. He's an immortal. So you get added meaning in that epithet all of a sudden. And Homer does this throughout. He knows at what point he can use some of these adjectives or epithets to make a point. Okay, now here are some of the themes that we have. The main theme of the Iliad is menis, wrath, and another one is revenge. The first part of the Iliad is based on Achilles' anger, and one of the important questions when we get into the Iliad is, so why is anger so important? What makes Achilles so important? Just because he's angry, he sits out the war, and the war goes bad for his people, the Greeks, and a lot of them die. Is he a fool? Is he full of himself? But you'll find out that that becomes very important, because what we're talking about, what we'll be talking about, is the warrior code. And it has to do with law. It has to do with justice. What Achilles is going to be questioning, because he gets angry, is the warrior code under which he has to live, fight, and die worth it? Why does he follow? Why do warriors follow this particular code that they live by? And the answer that Homer gives eventually, no, it's not worth it. And there are reasons that it's not worth it, and how they come to realize that, and that's the crux of the Iliad. So the wrath, we follow the wrath for 16 books, and in the 16th book, his best friend is killed. Patroclus is his name. He's killed by Hector, the enemy. And from that point on to the end of the Iliad, it becomes a revenge theme. Achilles forgets his anger for the time being and turns on revenge for his friend. So they become important. The next one that's very important in the Iliad is xenia, which means hospitality. Hospitality is so important to this period, 8th century, that it's put under Zeus. Zeus is known as Zeus Xenios, Xenios, which means Zeus of strangers. As a matter of fact, the word is still used today for hotels. Xenia means a hotel in Greece. Xenos means foreigner. Why was hospitality so important in this period? Because Greece is mainly a sea country. It's surrounded by ocean on all three sides. The fourth side, where Bulgaria, Romania is today, was wild. No one occupied it at the time. But land around the sea was important, so everything they had to do was by sea. And how could they go, if you go back to my map here, how could they go to any of these important centers in here, all these centers from here, except by sea? So if you go by sea, in the kind of boats that they had at the time, rowing boats, where would bathrooms be, for example? There weren't any. Where would they stay if they had to make the trip, which going across here takes a couple of days? It took Odysseus 10 years, but that's another story. For most people, if the weather is all right, they can make it a couple of days. So where do you sleep? You can only navigate in the day. So they had to go hug the coast usually, around like this, or go from island to island. There's a lot of islands here. And they could stop. And they could go up to any house, knock on the door, and they're obligated to receive service, food. But it also works the other way, that whoever house it is can be sure that no harm will come to them as a result, because it's under Zeus. That's why the abduction of Helen becomes so important, and the Greeks can do what they do by going to attack in Troy. Because if we allow hospitality to be broken at the top level, what happens to all the bottom levels? You can't allow that to happen. Hospitality has to remain in order to allow trade. And so hospitality becomes very important. No one can ever abuse a host, and a stranger can never abuse his host, and vice versa. And when Paris comes as an emissary to Sparta, as an ambassador, and walks away with Helen, even though they might have fallen in love, he is breaking the laws of hospitality, which cannot stand. That's why we know from the very beginning, from the first page, that no matter what happens, the Trojans are going to lose. That's known. That's another thing in oral poetry. You don't have to wait to see, don't tell me the ending. The ending is known from the beginning. It's the way they're going to lose that becomes important, which is another thing with Homer in his techniques. What happens, since everybody knows the story, what's he going to do for 24 books? We know they're going to go to Troy, they're going to fight, they're going to destroy Troy, and Helen will be returned. Well, all Homer can do is delay the situation and find ways of making you think, making the audience think that he's going to change the story. But he can't. He cannot change tradition. It has to remain the way everybody knows it. There's a few other terms that I put up there that become very important for a warrior, for all of these people in Homeric Greece. Those three words, honor, fame, and gifts, become very important. And that has to do with the warrior code. It's timi, kleos, hieros, honor, fame, gift. A warrior fights for fame. One of the important issues in the Iliad is mortality versus immortality. In Greek, this is very clear. The words for mortality, immortality is thanatos and athanatos, which means death and not death. Mortals are called those that are dead. not a very nice word. And immortals are those that are not dead. Actually, mort in Latin means death also, so it's the same thing, but it's much clearer in the Greek. So, the thing that every warrior is looking for is honor and fame. Why? Because it's the only immortality that a mortal can have in life. What can you leave behind? What does life mean? Except to be remembered in the memory of those that are living. That's immortality for a mortal. And once that is taken away, or can be taken away, then you have to question, well, what does life mean? Now, how do you know that one has fame and honor? By the third word, yetis, the gifts you accumulate in your life. How many experiences have you had in war? How many enemies did you kill? How many women did you bring back as slaves? How much booty did you collect? That's why when you read the Iliad and the Odyssey, the emphasis is on what these people come back with. For example, in the Odyssey, Odysseus is coming back with all this gold that he has accumulated over 10 years of fighting for Troy. And he loses every piece of it. Because at the very end, he's on a raft and he has nothing. He's lost it all. And yet, when he comes back home to Ithaca, he comes back with 3 times more gold than he would have had he had the original gold. How does he do that? Well, he ends up in an island where he finds some people that decide to bring him home, the Phaeacians, who are very wealthy, and they load him with gold. Why? Because his life would be meaningless if he comes back with nothing. Although he loses everything at some point, there must be a way where he can regain it before he returns, so that his life has meaning. So those 3 words become very important: honor, fame, and gifts. You have fame because of what you have accumulated. So in the Iliad, at the beginning, as you'll see, when Agamemnon takes Achilles' woman that has been given to him for what he has done to give him honor as a major warrior, and Agamemnon can merely take her away and says, no, I lost mine, I'm going to take yours. Then Achilles says, well, what does honor mean then, if it can be dismissed and taken away so quickly? What am I dying for if my honor can be taken away at a whim? And that's what starts the rolling and why he sits out the war. It gets a little more complicated than that when we get to it, but that's the basic idea. And then you have the other 2 terms that are very important, that are always in opposition to each other. Is it better to use force alone or intelligence alone? Or do you need a combination of both? And this is something that the warriors come to understand, that force alone doesn't work. It has to be mixed with metis, with intelligence. Via is force, metis is intelligence. And the original code, warrior code, is force. You have to be forceful. But Odysseus shows that it has to be combined with metis. After all, how is the Trojan War won? Not by force, by cleverness. When no one else can do anything anymore, they come with the idea of the Trojan horse. And that's how they win. Not that they're superior to the Trojans or the Trojans superior to the Greeks. They are at an impasse throughout. So those terms become important. And then, because of those terms, if I take the first one, for example, how does one achieve a balance between moderation and hubris, excess, is another question that's asked in the Iliad. You need moderation, and there has to be excess, but there has to be a balance between two. Or, why is there a need between via and metis, force and intelligence, which is in both epics? It's something that you find being played out in all of them. Another thing that's important in the Iliad that makes it such a special work is direct discourse. Most epics are narrated by a third person, the third person narrator, where somebody's telling you the story. In Homer, over 40% of the Iliad is in direct discourse, which means it's dramatic. It's the characters themselves speaking. Homer merely says, Achilles said, Odysseus said, and you get it in their words, which makes a lot of difference because the way Achilles feels towards his commander is very negative. And yet you, the reader, as you read the Iliad and you see some of the actions of the commander, can't have the same view that he has. Because when you get up to Book 11, for example, which is devoted to Agamemnon, you find out that he's a good warrior, that he's a good commander. Some people see him in a different way. So what are you to think of Achilles and Agamemnon? And you have to make up your own mind by reading closely, because there's a psychology between these characters going on. And it's because you have direct discourse. And that's why the Iliad is considered much closer to tragedy than to anything else. And the reason why the tragedians, almost all the tragedians that we know of, take their material from Homer. Because it's a tragedy of Achilles anyway. It's written almost like a tragedy. And the last thing I have that, which I should have mentioned earlier, I hinted at it. Homeric society is a shame culture. It's monarchical, it's patriarchal, slave-holding. So that has a lot to do with what goes on in the Iliad. Women have very little role in the Iliad. As a matter of fact, if you think back to the Odyssey, Penelope has to wait for her husband for 20 years by never coming out of her bedroom, but Odysseus can have affairs all the way back. And he does, with Calypso, with Circe, with all kinds of women. But that's okay, because he's a man. And the reason for that is because it is a patriarchal society, and a man has to know who his legitimate children are in order to leave his belongings. If Penelope was as loose as Clytemnestra is, Agamemnon's wife, there might be a question, who am I leaving my property to? But by having faithful women, a man knows that. So you have to keep those in mind. And shame culture, because when a woman that is given to Achilles as a prize for what he does is taken away, he is shamed. And in a shame culture, that means a great deal to a warrior. So those four things are important. Monarchical is important because Achilles doesn't really have to obey Agamemnon, who's commander-in-chief. He's commander-in-chief because his brother's wife was abducted, and he put the forces together to go to Troy, but he's no better than Achilles. Achilles is as much a king as Agamemnon is, as Odysseus is, as Nestor is, and all the other characters. So it's a monarchical society. Now, here are the epic tools that I was talking about. First of all, number one, an epic always begins in the middle. That's what that means in media res. And so all epics are supposed to begin in the middle. The Trojan War lasted for 10 years. Homer starts in the 10th year of the Trojan War and spends only 53 days. The whole Iliad is 53 days. And most of those 53 days are not even narrated. Only 16 of the 53 days are narrated. The others are merely mentioned. For example, at the beginning, Achilles goes to his goddess mother and says, you have to help me out. They took my woman away, and I want Zeus to punish these people, his own people, for taking my woman away. So his mother says, okay, I'll go to Zeus and ask for a favor. But Zeus is on vacation, and he's gone for 10 days. Well, those 10 days are not narrated. We're merely told he'll be back in 10 days. And you turn the page, and it's 10 days later. So that's how we can add up to 53 days. But the narrated part is only 16 or 15 days. And another thing is that, for me, the Iliad is made up of battles. There are 4 main battles in the Iliad. And all of these books, as I'll show you in a minute, take up those 4 battles. But the battles themselves only take up 6 days. So when we say Achilles sits out the war, he only sits out 6 days, and he comes back on the 6th. But Homer makes it so you think he's out there for an eternity, and they need him. One of the main qualities of the oral epic is similes. There are around 200 similes in the Iliad. And a simile, as you know, is comparing one thing to another using like or as. A is like B. A is as B. The Homeric simile is reversed. You talk about B first, and at the end, you talk about A. And I want to give you an example because the simile is one of the most important techniques of an epic. So I have one here that I want to mention. And this type of simile appears often. Okay, here's a simile. This is from the middle book, 12. Now, I start with B, about snow. And they, as storms of snow, descend to the ground, incessant on a winter day, when Zeus of the consuls, showing before men what shafts he possesses, brings on a snowstorm and stills the winds asleep in the solid drift, enshrouding the peaks that tower among the mountains and the shoulders out jutting, and the lowlands with their grasses and the prospering work of men's hands, and the drift falls along the gray sea, the harbors and beaches, and the surf that breaks against it is stilled, and all things elsewhere it shrouds from above, with the burden of Zeus's reign heavy upon it. Now comes A. So, numerous and incessant were the stones volleyed from both sides. So here he's comparing a battle where Trojans are throwing stones and whatever, and he's comparing it to snow falling. Now, why that? Well, for one thing, he takes you out of a battle into a peacetime world with snow. Snow is very silent. When it falls in a silent forest, it silences everything around it. It covers everything. And then all of a sudden, after describing this, boom, he sends you into the battle with rocks and all kinds of things falling, and shows you the difference between war and peace. The Iliad is a poem of peace. It says something about war and emphasizes peace. And that's what many similes do. And since there's so much fighting in the Iliad, I said 4 battles that take up all but 2 of the 24 books. You have to have relief. And the relief comes in the similes. And that's why there's some 200 of these throughout the Iliad. The Odyssey, for example, which has more action, doesn't have more than 40 similes. So you can see the difference. So that's one of the important epic tools. There are many. These are some of the most important. Another one is digressions. If everybody knows the story of the Iliad, as the audience does in Homer's time, he has to change the myth sometimes, or he has to digress from the main storyline, which is the destruction of Troy, to take you to other things, to give you other information. If he's writing the Iliad, if he's only taking 53 days of the Trojan War myth to tell the Iliad, how does he inform his audience of the previous 9 years? What led to these 53 days? He does through digressions, by taking you back and forth to the beginning of the conflict, even before the conflict, how it came about. Why is Agamemnon the way he is, and he feels the way he is? What about having to sacrifice his daughter, Janiah, in order to come to Troy, which is not part of the Iliad? It happened long before, but he couldn't get to Troy unless he sacrificed his young 13-year-old daughter to get favorable winds in order to sail to Troy. What does that do to him? And what he has, the way he has to act when he's there. So those are digressions. Then you also have misdirections. Misdirections are important because of what I just said about the story. Everybody knows the story. So in book 3 and 7, we have 2 duels. The first duel in book 3 is between Menelaus, the husband of Helen, and Paris, her lover. Somebody, early on in the Iliad, the 3rd book, says, why are we fighting? Why don't we let the people responsible fight it out and the rest of us can go home? Everybody agrees. Let Menelaus and Paris fight it out, and whoever wins, that's it. If Menelaus wins, he takes his wife and goes. If Paris wins, Menelaus has to leave. Well, we know that can't happen because we already know the story, but it's a digression. And you wonder, why is Homer doing this? What if one of these 2 people win? Well, he's not going to allow it. He's going to let you think one of them is winning, but at the end, it's going to come back to where it should be. Now, you do that in book 3. In book 7, somebody says, why doesn't Hector challenge? Hector is the main Trojan warrior. Why doesn't he challenge any Greek warrior that wants to stand before him? And whoever wins, that ends the war. Well, Ajax stands up. Ajax is number 2 man after Achilles. And they're going to fight. Again, if this happens, it destroys the story. As we know, it's not going to happen. But it's a digression. And you have this going on throughout the Iliad. Then you have Aristeas, another technique which is important. Every warrior must show his excellence. Aristos means excellent. He must show what he's worth. And so a book is devoted to each of the major characters to show what they're made of. There are 5 main Aristeas in the Iliad by the major characters: Achilles, Hector, Patroclus, Diomedes, Ajax. How many did I name? Agamemnon. They each have a time where they show what they can do. But in showing their excellence, it also brings out their psychology. For example, when we talk about Agamemnon, his shield that he holds has as its main symbol Medusa, this face with hairs of snake that when you look at it, you turn to stone. Well, it says something about the darkness in Agamemnon. Whereas Achilles' shield has stars and constellations and all sorts of other things, which shows something about his character. Even their dress, the way they dress, is important, because it says something about them. And that goes to the other comment there, type scenes. In an oral work, everything is almost a type scene. The way people eat, the way they sleep, the way they fight are standard. There are certain qualities that describe each. For example, when they have a banquet, the line always ends the same way every time they eat. Thus thereafter, the whole day long until the sun went under, they feasted, nor was anyone's hunger denied a fair portion. That line must appear 20, 30 times in the Iliad, because they feasted, and nor was anyone's hunger denied a fair portion. So by using that line 40 times, you don't have to memorize 15,697 lines. You can eliminate 40. And that's why an oral poet can memorize all these things. But type scenes are usually made up of so many qualities. For example, if a person is fighting, there's so many things you can talk about. You can talk about his opponent. You can talk about who gets killed first, how he throws his spear. And let's say there are about usually 20 qualities. Now, every time someone fights, you don't have to mention all 20. You can select from those 20. That gives variety. I can do 1, 3, 5, 7, or I can do 17, 20, 16 for another one. And that keeps the story moving. But they're all type scenes that the author, the singer, knows. A battle has so many that I've memorized, so when it comes to a battle, I'm going to use some of these. That's what type scene is. Necrologues, another type. Necrologues means something that you say about the person that has died. The word necros means dead. So, every person that dies, and there are hundreds of characters, I think about 260 main speaking parts in the Iliad. And there are many minor parts. Everyone has a story. Homer looks at every person. No one dies who isn't somebody, or has somebody that's waiting for him, loves him, will listen, and he will talk about that. That's what a necrologue is. And that too is a type scene. You can talk about parents, you can talk about one's family, you can talk about one's birth, you can talk about genealogy, and again, you select from these to describe certain people that have fallen. And sometimes they're described in such a way that Homer makes a point about the disasters of war, the ridiculousness of war, by the way he presents these necrologues. And then you have the formulas and epithets that I talked about, the adjectives that are attached. Owl-eyed Athena, she's often referred to owl-eyed. Sometimes those adjectives describe a quality that becomes important in certain areas. Sometimes they're epithets that are attached to a name because of a previous life. For example, owl-eyed Athena probably refers to the fact that Athena, before the Greeks adopted these gods and anthropomorphized them, made them human, they were theriomorphic, they were beast gods. So Athena could have been an owl goddess. And when the Greeks brought her into their pantheon of gods, they retained the symbols, but they made them human, like themselves. So Hera is cow-eyed. Zeus is associated with an eagle. And all of these gods have certain epithets that describe perhaps a previous life. Those are the formulas and epithets. And then we have catalogs. And this is what drives students crazy. Because in the second book of the Iliad, Homer is going to tell us about the forces that have come to Troy. And he names 29 contingents that had 44 kings that come with 1,187 ships and a fleet of 500,000 men. And he goes through every name for a whole book. And that's where you turn off and says, I'll skip this book and go to another.
And that's the one in your exam, right?
Yes. But that's important because it shows you how the kind of feats that a good oral singer can do. How can one memorize all of these names and sing them in dactylic hexameter to a crowd? This is the moment they're waiting for. Can you do this? And there are many catalogs. There's a catalog of Nereids, that is sea nymphs that he recites. There's the catalog of gifts that Agamemnon is willing to give to Achilles if he comes back. There's a series of gifts that Priam, the king of Troy, is willing to give to Achilles to return the body of his son Hector at the end. Many catalogs. And this shows what an oral singer can do. So those are some of the more important techniques. And there are probably some 20 altogether. Now, speeches is another one, for example. There are all kinds of speeches that people give. There's a speech for prayer kind of speech. There's speeches when a person dies, and they also follow a certain format. Okay, now we come to the structure of the Iliad. And here you see the 53 days and the way they're used. The first book covers 21 days, but actually 1 day is narrated, pretty much. The others, as I said, is Zeus is on vacation, they have to wait so many days, etc. And then you have the 4 battles. Books 2 to 7 take up the first battle and take place over a period of 2 days, day 22 to 24. Books 8 to 10 cover only 1 day. There you have 8, 9, 10, 3 books that cover 1 day, which is battle 2. Books 11 to 18, that's the longest battle, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 1 day, day 26. Battle 3. And 19 to 23, 1 day again, battle 4. And then book 4, as book 1, does days 28 to 53, because for 10 days Achilles drags Hector's body around Troy. We're just told 10 days, and it's just that. Another 10 days it takes to bury Hector. We're just told it took 10 days. And they add up that way. But it also shows something else. If you just look at that, there's a certain structure, and there's something called ring composition, which is very important in the Iliad. Ring composition is what you say in book 1 in a particular order, you reverse that order for book 24 at the end. So if I say A, B, C for book 1, then I say C, B, A for book 24. That doesn't only happen between books, but it happens within books. So there's a great deal of structure in the Iliad, which makes it the kind of work that it is. Now I come to the last part, which is only going to take a few minutes since I'm done here. And I end with this painting. This is Rembrandt. And it's 1653. And he calls the picture, which is in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Aristotle contemplating the bust of Homer. Well, that's not Aristotle. That's the man who ordered the painting from Rembrandt, and he's dressed in Renaissance clothes. And that's not Homer. No one knows what Homer was like or who he was. Rembrandt was shopping around in the flea market and found this bust and said, all right, this is going to be Homer. And since 1653, that's who we think Homer is, because I have that statue in my desk too. But that's supposed to be Homer. Nobody knows who Homer was. Nobody knows that there was a Homer, or how many Homers. More and more, scholars believe that Homer is merely a name assigned to these various singers that went up and down the Ionic coast and sang these songs. There could be a master singer among them whose text, oral text, received maybe more attention than some others when they were finally trying to find a common text to pull together from all these various oral texts, much like as the Old Testament is. What they did is trying to find which stories were the most dominant and then use them. That's why at the beginning of Genesis you can have that man was created from the rib of Adam, and then the next paragraph says God takes a handful of dirt and makes man, and a handful and makes woman. So which is it? Does he do it from the rib of man or from the dirt? But both of those stories were prevalent enough that they had to include them. We do the same in oral literature. When you're looking at all these hundreds of oral texts that are around, which ones are going to be edited in a way that presents the true text? So Homer might not have existed. Those that think he did place him around the island of Chios, which is right across Smyrna, which is the Greek city of Izmir. The Greeks still call, Izmir is the Turkey, Smyrna is the Greek. They still refer to it as Smyrna. So 9 different places actually claim Homer's birth. Most of them are around the Ionic coast, and only 3 are over by Athens. And if you go to these places, for example, on the island of Chios, you can sit on Homer's rock and talk. Or on the island of Ios, you can visit his grave. But even the locals say, this is really a myth, it's not so. So that's Homer. It's a name that we use. It can mean, Homer also means the lonely one, the monk, someone alone. And there was a guild of singers called HOMER'ILIAD, which means the sons of Homer, that sang a song. So they might have taken their name from a major singer, or there might have been a Homer, or he could have been a woman as something. So that's the introduction to the Iliad. Next, I'll talk about some of these books, 9 at a time.